The sand was red before the sun came up. That's what Corporal James Haddock would remember years later when reporters asked him about the day that changed everything. Not the sound of the mortars, not the screaming, not even the moment he thought he was going to die. Just the sand, soaked dark in the pre-dawn light of Helmand Province, and the way it stuck to his hands when he tried to reload. The Taliban had been closing in for 40 minutes. Haddock's fire team was supposed to be extracted at 0400. It was now 0530, and the radio in his pack had taken shrapnel 20 minutes ago. 3 Marines down, 7 still breathing, and somewhere in the mountains to the north, 200 fighters with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Haddock didn't know it yet, but his survival would depend on a pilot most people had written off 3 years earlier. A captain with a call sign that made junior officers smirk and senior brass look away. Someone who had been passed over for promotion twice, who flew missions nobody wanted, who had stopped attending squadron events because the silence was worse than the insults. Her name was Maya Reyes. Her call sign was Gravedigger. And when the operations officer at Camp Dwyer heard Haddock's last encrypted burst transmission, the one that came through a relay before the radio died, the only available close air support within 30 minutes was an A-10 Thunderbolt II with tail number 479er, and a pilot everyone assumed had lost her edge. The tower controller at Dwyer didn't sound confident when he handed off the coordinates. The operations officer, a major named Torrens who had flown Hornets in the Gulf, actually hesitated before authorizing the sortie. Because Maya Reyes had a reputation, not for being reckless, not for being incompetent, but for being a woman in a jet that most Marines considered sacred ground, and for having the audacity to be better at it than most of the men who resented her. 3 years ago, she had put a 30-millimeter cannon round through a truck windshield from 4,000 feet while taking ground fire, saved 11 Marines, got a medal and a formal complaint on the same day. The complaint claimed she had endangered friendly forces by flying too low. The Marines she saved sent her a unit coin and a case of beer. She kept the coin, never opened the beer, stopped talking about it altogether. Now she was wheels up before the sun touched the eastern ridgeline, her A-10's twin turbofans spooling with a sound like contained rage. The sky over Helmand was purple and gold. Somewhere below, Corporal Haddock was counting bullets. Maya's helmet visor reflected the glow of her instruments as she climbed through 8,000 feet. The A-10 handled like a freight train with wings, all blunt force and physics, nothing graceful about it. She loved it the way some people love old dogs. Her weapons officer at Bagram had uploaded coordinates to her targeting pod before she launched, but the grid was already 20 minutes old. Infantry firefights moved. She knew that. The controllers knew that. What nobody said out loud was that old coordinates in a hot zone meant flying low, getting close, and trusting your eyes more than your electronics. It also meant exposure. She checked her fuel, checked her ammunition counter. 1,100 rounds of 30mm high-explosive incendiary remaining, Mavericks on the outboard pylons, rockets inboard. The A-10 was built for one thing, turning enemy armor into scrap metal and doing it close enough to see the smoke. She had done this 43 times. Not all of them went well. Most of them nobody talked about. One of them ended a career before it started, but that wasn't her career, and the pilot involved never blamed her, even when it would have helped. The radio crackled. Gravedigger 1-1, Widow TOC. Friendlies are danger close. Last known position grid November Victor 73459 No comms from ground element, estimating 200 hostiles advancing from ridgeline north. Cleared hot on positively identified targets only. How copy? Maya's voice came back flat, professional. Widow TOC, Gravedigger copies all, proceeding to grid, say nature of terrain. Gravedigger, terrain is mountainous with scattered compounds. Friendlies last reported in Wadi system eastern edge of the village. Heavy small arms and possible RPGs. She didn't acknowledge, just banked east and dropped to 6,000 feet. The sun was cresting now, turning the desert floor bronze. Helmand Province in October was cold at altitude, but the ground would be heating fast. Thermals would start rising. Visibility would get worse. She had maybe 30 minutes of good light before the haze set in. 30 minutes to find 7 Marines in 300 square kilometers of terrain that all looked the same from the air. Her targeting pod swiveled, the screen painting green and gray images of compounds, walls, the skeletal remains of Soviet-era fighting positions. Nothing moved. She descended to 4,000 feet. The A-10's engines roared louder, the sound bouncing off the ridgelines. Anyone down there would hear her coming. That was fine. Sometimes the sound alone made people reconsider their choices. Then she saw the smoke, thin black rising from a position 2 kilometers south of the uploaded grid. She zoomed the targeting pod. The image sharpened. 3 vehicles burning, small figures moving near a dry riverbed. She counted them. 8, no 9. Muzzle flashes near the compound walls to the north. A lot of them. She keyed her radio. Widow TOC, Gravedigger has visual on smoke and ground fire. Grid November Victor 7369 or 7. Confirmed friendlies are not in compounds north of Wadi. The response took 6 seconds. 6 seconds was a lifetime. Gravedigger confirmed. Friendlies are south of Wadi. North is hostile. Maya armed her gun. The A-10's nose was built around the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired rounds the size of beer bottles at 65 per second. The recoil was so powerful it could stall the engines if she fired too long. The sound was biblical. She had heard Marines call it the voice of God. She had heard Taliban fighters call it the dragon. She didn't care what they called it. She only cared that it worked. She rolled inverted, pulled the stick back, and dove. The A-10 came down at a 40-degree angle, nose pointed at the northern compound wall. Her airspeed climbed. 200 knots, 250, 300. The targeting pipper centered on a cluster of heat signatures. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared. The entire airframe shuddered. Smoke filled the cockpit for a second before the ventilation cleared it. 30-millimeter rounds walked across the compound like the footsteps of something ancient and furious. Stone exploded. Bodies disappeared into the dust. She pulled out at 1,500 feet, hard enough that her vision grayed at the edges, and climbed back to altitude. The radio was screaming now. Not the controller, someone else. Whoever the hell that was, you just saved our lives. We have wounded, need immediate extract, grid to follow. Maya didn't respond. She was already lining up her second pass. The fighters near the wadi were scattering, running for a tree line to the west. She counted 20, maybe 30. They were dragging something. Weapons, a mortar tube. She armed a rocket pod and came around from the east, low this time, using the ridgeline to mask her approach. The A-10 shook as she pickled 4 rockets. White trails arced downward. The impacts were sequential, tearing through the tree line like zippers. Fire bloomed orange and black. She climbed again, scanning for more targets. Her fuel was at 60%. Time on station. Another 15 minutes, maybe 20 if she pushed it. The radio crackled again, different voice, calmer. Gravedigger 1-1, this is Sabre 2-6, ground commander. We have 7 effective, 3 urgent surgical. Enemy has broken contact to the north, but we are still danger close to multiple positions. Can you maintain station? Maya checked her ammunition. 900 rounds remaining, 4 Mavericks, half her rockets gone. She keyed the mic. Sabre 2-6, Gravedigger can maintain. What do you need? Gravedigger, we need you to keep them off us until extract arrives. Rotary wing inbound, ETA 12 minutes. If they come back, we're done. 12 minutes. Maya orbited at 4,000 feet, eyes on the ground, watching for movement. The battlefield had gone quiet. Smoke drifted from the compound. Bodies lay in the wadi still. The Marines below were regrouping, pulling security, tending to their wounded. She could see it all through the targeting pod, the way they moved, the way they kept looking north. Waiting. She was waiting too. Then she saw them. Fighters, maybe 40 of them, moving through a ravine 3 kilometers north. They were trying to flank, coming around from the west. They hadn't seen her yet. She keyed the radio. Sabre 2-6, Gravedigger has visual on approximately 40 hostiles moving to flank your position from grid November Victor 733601. Engaging now. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, rolled in, lined up the ravine and squeezed the trigger. The cannon sang. The ravine filled with dust and fire. She held the trigger for 4 seconds, felt the airframe shutter pulled off hard. The A-10 climbed through its own smoke. When she looked back, the ravine was silent. The radio was not. Someone was shouting, laughing, crying. She couldn't tell which. The helicopters came 8 minutes later, 2 Ospreys with marine markings and door gunners scanning the ridgelines. Maya orbited overhead, watching the extract. The Marines moved fast, carrying their wounded, covering each other, loading into the Ospreys with the kind of urgency that came from experience. Within 3 minutes they were airborne. Maya watched them disappear to the south, then turned her own aircraft toward Dwyer. Her fuel was at 30%. Her hands were steady on the stick. The sun was fully up now, the desert below shimmering in the heat. She didn't feel anything yet. That would come later. The landing was routine. Shutdown was routine. The crew chief who chalked her wheels gave her a thumbs up. She climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat, and walked toward the operations shack. Major Torrens was standing outside, arms crossed. He watched her approach. She stopped 3 feet away, waited. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good shooting, Captain." She nodded back, didn't smile, didn't say anything. Just walked past him into the shack, logged her flight time, and headed for debriefing. Nobody mentioned the call sign, not that day, not ever again around her. Because whatever Maya Ray's had been before that morning, whatever doubts or whispers had followed her, they died in that wadi along with everything else. Gravedigger wasn't an insult anymore. It was a promise. Corporal James Haddock spent 2 days at the field hospital before they sent him to Landstuhl. He had a shattered collarbone, burns on his left arm, and hearing damage that would never fully heal. While he waited for transport, he asked everyone who came through the tent if they knew the pilot who saved him. Most of them shrugged. One of them, a logistics officer who had been at Dwyer that morning, told him the call sign. Gravedigger. Haddock asked what it meant. The officer shrugged again. "She doesn't talk about it." But someone else did. A gunnery sergeant named Oakes who had been in country for 3 rotations and knew every story worth knowing. He sat down next to Haddock's cot that evening with a cup of coffee that smelled like burnt plastic and told him the story everyone knew but nobody said out loud. 3 years ago, Maya Ray's had been part of a 2-ship close air support mission near Marja. She was flying wing for a senior captain named Vickers, a guy with 15 years in and a chest full of medals. Good pilot, good leader, but that day the intelligence was wrong. The compound they were targeting wasn't enemy, it was friendly, Afghan police. The forward air controller had the wrong grid. Vickers was already rolling in when Maya saw it, saw the vehicles parked outside, saw the blue-on-white flag. She called aboard on the radio. Vickers didn't hear her. Radio malfunction. She had maybe 3 seconds to decide. She did the only thing she could do. She lit her afterburners and cut in front of him, forced him to pull off. He was furious. Wrote her up for reckless flying, for breaking protocol, for endangering both of them. It went all the way to the wing commander. The investigation took 4 months. In the end, they cleared her. The intelligence failure was documented. The lives she saved were counted. 23 Afghan police, 4 interpreters, 2 kids who had been playing in the courtyard. But Vickers never forgave her. He told anyone who would listen that she had showboated, that she had made him look bad, that she couldn't be trusted. He was well liked. She wasn't. The story spread. Her call sign changed. It used to be Raven. After that, someone started calling her Gravedigger because she buried careers, because she made people look twice before trusting her, because she was the one who saw the bodies before they happened. It stuck. She never fought it, never explained. Just kept flying, kept doing the job, and waited for the day when the work would speak for itself. Haddock listened to all of it, then stared at the tent ceiling for a long time. Finally he said, "Where is she now?" Oakes shrugged. "Probably flying, that's all she does." Haddock never met Maya Ray's, not in person. But he wrote a letter and the chaplain at Landstuhl made sure it got to her. She never wrote back. Didn't need to. 3 months later, when Haddock was stateside and going through physical therapy at Bethesda, he got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a unit coin from the 75th Fighter Squadron, the A-10 unit at Bagram. On the back, engraved in small letters, "Not all graves are for the dead." He kept it in his pocket for the next 11 years. Still does. But that morning, none of that had happened yet. Maya Reyes was just another pilot filing another after-action report, sitting in a folding chair in a plywood shack, answering questions from an intelligence officer who barely looked at her. She gave the coordinates, the munitions expended, the estimated enemy casualties. She described the terrain, the engagement sequence, the radio calls. The intelligence officer typed it all into a laptop, nodded occasionally, and when she was done, he closed the file and said, "Nice work, Captain. Dismissed." She stood up, walked out into the sunlight, and realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from the weight of what she carried, the things she saw, the moments that never made it into after-action reports. The faces in the targeting pod, there 1 second and gone the next. The knowledge that every trigger pull was a choice, and every choice had a cost, and the cost was paid by someone even if it wasn't always her. She walked to the chow hall, got a cup of coffee, and sat outside at a picnic table someone had built from pallets. The sun was hot. The coffee was bad. She drank it anyway. Across the flight line, her A-10 was being rearmed and refueled. The crew chiefs moved around it with practiced efficiency, loading ammunition, checking hydraulics, inspecting for damage. One of them, a young corporal named Diaz, saw her watching and waved. She waved back. Diaz had asked her once why she loved the A-10. She told him it was the only aircraft that had ever made sense to her. No pretense, no elegance, just brutal honesty and the willingness to get hurt to do the job. He had laughed, said that sounded like a person, not a plane. She hadn't corrected him. The next mission came 4 hours later. Different grid, same war. She flew it the way she flew all of them, precisely, carefully, without hesitation. She came back with empty pylons and a hydraulic leak that maintenance traced to a bullet hole in the left stabilator. The bullet had missed critical systems by 6 inches. Diaz patched it with speed tape and told her she was lucky. She didn't argue. Luck was real, but it wasn't something you relied on. You relied on training, on discipline, on knowing your aircraft so well that flying it became instinct. Luck was what happened when all of that wasn't enough. That night in the transient officer's quarters, she lay on her bunk and stared at the plywood ceiling. Someone in the next room was watching a movie, the sound muffled through the thin walls. She could hear explosions, dialogue, a soundtrack that swelled at all the right moments. Real war didn't have a soundtrack. It had silence broken by violence, then more silence, then the radio voices of people trying to stay alive. It had the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and cordite and sweat. It had the weight of knowing that your decisions determined who went home and who didn't, and that you would carry those decisions long after the war ended. She thought about Corporal Haddock, wondered if he would remember her or just the sound of the cannon. She thought about Vickers, wherever he was now, and whether he still told the story. She thought about the 23 Afghan police officers and the 2 kids in the courtyard, the ones whose names she never learned but whose faces sometimes appeared when she closed her eyes. She thought about call signs and reputations, and the strange, arbitrary cruelty of how people decided who was worthy and who wasn't. And then she stopped thinking and went to sleep, because the alarm would go off at 0400, and there would be another mission, another grid, another chance to prove that the work mattered more than the words. The weeks blurred together. October became November. The weather turned cold, the kind of cold that made pre-flight checks miserable and taxiing a test of patience. Maya flew 63 missions in 40 days. Some of them were routine patrols, orbiting over convoys, watching for ambushes that never came. Some of them were chaos, troops in contact, coordinates screamed over the radio, the desperate arithmetic of deciding which target to engage first when there were too many targets and not enough time. She lost count of the cannon rounds fired. The Mavericks launched. The hours in the cockpit that blurred into a single continuous experience of altitude and speed, and the green glow of her instruments. She also stopped checking her email, stopped going to the chow hall during peak hours, stopped attending the weekly intelligence briefs unless they were mandatory. It wasn't depression. It wasn't burnout. It was focus. She had learned that the noise of other people's opinions, their judgments, their need to categorize and label and rank, was a distraction from the only thing that mattered, being ready when the call came. And the call always came. In early November, it came at 0200, a scramble order that sent her running across the flight line in the dark, her breath fogging in the cold. The brief was 5 minutes long. Marines trapped in a compound near Sangin, 40 hostiles outside the walls, no extraction possible until daylight. She was airborne in 12 minutes, climbing through cloud cover so thick she flew on instruments until she broke through at 9,000 feet. The stars were hard and bright above her. Below, the world was invisible. She descended into the soup at the coordinates, breaking through at 3,000 feet to find the ground lit by fire. The compound was burning. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness like meteors in reverse. She could see the Marines on her targeting pod, clustered in one corner of the compound, returning fire. She could see the attackers, dozens of them, moving through the ruins of adjacent buildings. She called in, got clearance, and went to work. The next 2 hours were the longest of her career. She made 11 passes, expending everything she had: cannon rounds, rockets, both Mavericks. She flew so low on the last pass that she could see individual figures scattering in the firelight. Her airframe took hits. She felt them, heard them, kept flying. When the extract helicopters finally arrived at dawn, she was down to fumes and flying on one engine. The crew chief at Dwyer counted 14 bullet holes when she landed. One of them had severed a fuel line. Another had punctured the canopy 6 inches from her head. Diaz looked at the damage and said, "Captain, you should be dead." She unbuckled her harness, climbed down, and said, "But I'm not." That was the day the nickname stopped being whispered and started being shouted. The Marines she saved that night made sure of it. They came to Dwyer 2 days later, all 19 of them, and found her in the maintenance hangar supervising repairs to her aircraft. Their lieutenant, a kid named Tran who looked about 16, walked up to her and said, "Ma'am, we wanted to thank you." Maya shook his hand, said, "Just doing my job," and tried to leave. Tran didn't let her. He had the whole platoon with him, and they presented her with a plaque they had made from scrap wood and shrapnel, the words burned into the surface with a welding torch. To Captain Maya Reyes, Gravedigger 11, "You held the line when no one else could. Semper Fi." She took the plaque, looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at them, these kids who had been shooting and bleeding and watching their friends die, and said the only thing she could think to say: "It was an honor to fly for you." They left, and she stood there holding the plaque, and for the first time in 3 years she felt something other than the weight. She felt the lightness of being seen, not for what people said she was, but for what she had done. It didn't erase the past. It didn't change the call sign or the whispers or the way some officers still looked at her like she was a problem to be managed. But it was enough. She hung the plaque in her quarters, next to a picture of her and a map of Helmand Province. She looked at it every morning before she walked to the flight line, and every night before she went to sleep. It reminded her why she was there, not for the medals or the recognition or the chance to prove anyone wrong, but for the people on the ground, the ones who needed someone overhead, the ones who were counting on her to be fast and accurate and willing to take the risks that came with the job. December came. The deployment was almost over. Maya had 47 days left in country, and she was counting them the way everyone counted them, not with hope, but with the grim patience of someone who knew that the worst could happen on the last day just as easily as the first. She flew every mission like it was the last, because in a way, they all were. Every time she strapped into the cockpit, every time she spooled the engines and felt the familiar shudder of the A-10 coming to life, she knew it might be the time something went wrong. Mechanical failure, enemy fire, pilot error. The math was unforgiving. On December 9th, the math caught up. Not to her, to someone else. A pilot named Kessler flying an F-16 out of Bagram. He took a SAM over Kandahar, ejected, landed in hostile territory. The rescue package was immediate. Helicopters, air cover, a platoon of Rangers fast-roping into hell. Maya was tasked as close air support, orbiting overhead while the Rangers fought their way to Kessler's position. She saw the whole thing unfold through her targeting pod. Saw the Rangers moving through the village, saw the ambush from the rooftops, saw Kessler on the ground, injured trying to crawl toward the extraction point. She made 3 passes, suppressing the ambush, keeping the Rangers alive. On the 4th pass, she saw movement on a rooftop, a figure with an RPG lining up on the lead helicopter. She didn't hesitate, squeezed the trigger, the cannon roared. The rooftop disintegrated. The helicopter survived. Kessler was extracted alive. The Rangers took no casualties. It was a perfect mission, the kind that made it into briefings and commendations. But Maya didn't sleep that night. She kept seeing the figure on the rooftop, the way they had fallen, the way the building had collapsed. She kept thinking about the choice she made, the instantaneous calculus of 1 life versus 12. She had made the right call. She knew that, but knowing didn't make it easier. It never did. The next morning, she got called to the squadron commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Harkin was a career pilot, someone who had flown in both Iraq wars and Afghanistan, someone who understood the job. He told her to sit down, offered her coffee, and then said, "Captain Reyes, I'm putting you in for a medal." She shook her head. "I don't need a medal, sir." Harkin leaned back in his chair. "Maybe not. But the Marines you've been flying for, the Rangers you saved yesterday, they think you do. So do I. You've flown 96 missions this deployment, Captain. 96. Most pilots tap out at 40. You've expended more ordnance than any other A-10 pilot in this theater. You've saved more lives than I can count. And you've done it all while carrying a reputation that would have broken most people." Maya didn't say anything. Harkin continued. "I know what they call you, I know why, and I know what happened with Vickers. For what it's worth, he was wrong. He was bitter and wrong, and you paid the price for his ego. But that's over now. You've proved yourself 100 times over. It's time you started believing it." She looked at him, this man who had commanded hundreds of pilots, who had seen every kind of courage and cowardice, and she said, "Sir, I don't fly for medals. I fly because someone has to." Harkin smiled. "I know, that's why you're getting one anyway." The medal ceremony was 2 weeks later, at Bagram, in a hangar that smelled like jet fuel and ambition. There were generals and cameras and a speech about valor and sacrifice. Maya stood at attention, accepted the Distinguished Flying Cross, and shook hands with people whose names she forgot immediately. What she remembered was the crowd. 50 Marines standing in the back, still in their combat gear, still covered in dust. They had come from Helmand just to be there. When the ceremony ended, they surrounded her, and one of them, a staff sergeant named Cruz, said, "Ma'am, we're never going to forget what you did for us." She looked at him, at all of them, and said, "I won't forget either." She meant it. Not the medal, not the ceremony, but the weight of being trusted with their lives. That was the thing she carried. Not the call sign, not the reputation, but the knowledge that when the call came, she had answered. Every time, without hesitation. That was the legacy. Not the words people said, but the work she did. Her deployment ended in January. She flew her last mission on the 14th, a routine patrol over Helmand that turned into a 4-hour ordeal supporting a convoy that hit an IED. She stayed on station until her fuel was at emergency reserves, then handed off to another pilot and headed home. The landing at Dwyer was routine. The shutdown was routine. The walk from the flight line to the ops shack was the longest of her life. Diaz was there along with the rest of the crew. They had lined up outside the hangar, and when she walked past, they saluted. Not the formal regulation salute, but something else. Recognition. Respect. She returned it, kept walking, and didn't look back. If she had, she might have seen them watching her go, might have seen the way they stood a little straighter, the way they nodded to each other. She might have understood that she had changed something, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. The flight home was commercial, a rotator out of Bagram that stopped in Germany and then continued to Virginia. She slept most of the way, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes after months of adrenaline and alertness. When she woke, they were descending into Norfolk. The sun was setting. The land below was green and orderly and so far removed from the desert that it felt like a different planet. She processed out at Oceana, turned in her gear, signed the paperwork, and drove to her apartment in Virginia Beach. It was exactly as she had left it, empty, clean, impersonal. She dropped her bags by the door, walked to the window, and looked out at the ocean. The waves rolled in, steady and indifferent. She stood there for a long time, thinking about nothing and everything, and then she sat down on the couch and cried. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of being home, of being safe, of being alive when so many others weren't. She gave herself 10 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, and started unpacking. Life didn't stop for grief or exhaustion or the strange, dislocating experience of returning from war. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, a job to report to. She was assigned to a training squadron at Oceana, tasked with teaching new pilots how to fly the A-10. It was a good assignment, a career builder, the kind of job that led to promotions and command opportunities. She took it seriously. But the transition was harder than she expected. The new pilots were eager, confident, full of questions. They wanted to know what combat was like, what it felt like to kill someone, whether she was scared. She answered their questions carefully, honestly, but she could see the disconnect in their eyes. They didn't understand yet. They thought war was adrenaline and heroism and the clarity of purpose. They didn't know about the silence afterward, the weight of choices, the faces you saw in the targeting pod and couldn't unsee. One of them, a lieutenant named Foster, asked her during a training flight why her call sign was Gravedigger. She had been expecting the question. She always did when new pilots came through. She leveled the aircraft at 10,000 feet, looked out at the Virginia coastline below, and said, "Because I bury mistakes before they become bodies." Foster didn't ask again. None of them did. But the story got around anyway, the way stories always did in the Air Force. Some versions were close to the truth. Others were exaggerated, mythologized, turned into cautionary tales or legends depending on who was telling them. Maya didn't correct anyone. She just kept teaching, kept flying, and waited for the day when the past would finally release its grip. That day came in April, 2 years after her deployment ended. She was at Oceana, walking across the flight line after a training sortie when someone called her name. She turned. It was Corporal James Haddock. He was older now, thicker through the shoulders, walking with a slight limp, but the eyes were the same. He crossed the tarmac, stopped 3 feet away, and said, "Captain Reyes, I've been looking for you." She didn't recognize him at first. Then she saw the scar on his neck, the way he held his left arm slightly bent, and she remembered. The wadi, the smoke, the voice on the radio screaming that whoever had just saved them needed to know they were heroes. She said, "Corporal Haddock." He nodded. "I wanted to thank you in person. I tried writing, but it didn't seem like enough." She didn't know what to say. Thank yous always felt strange, like acknowledgement of something too large to be contained in words. Finally she said, "You don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job." Haddock shook his head. "No, ma'am, you did a lot more than that. You gave me my life back, gave all of us our lives back. I have a daughter now, she's 2. I get to watch her grow up because of you, so yeah, I do owe you, and I'm not the only one." He handed her an envelope. She opened it. Inside was a letter handwritten, signed by 63 Marines. All of them people she had flown for, people she had saved, people whose names she didn't know but whose coordinates she remembered. The letter said simply, "Thank you for being there when we needed you. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for proving that honor and skill matter more than rank or reputation. You are the reason we came home." She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and looked at Haddock. He was smiling, tears in his eyes. She felt her own eyes burning, but she didn't cry. Not here. Not now. Instead she said, "Thank you for this. It means more than you know." They talked for a few more minutes. exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch. Then Haddock left and Maya stood there on the flight line, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of 63 lives and the strange, miraculous fact that they were still living. She walked back to the squadron building, went to her office, and pinned the letter to the wall next to the plaque from Lieutenant Tran's platoon. It stayed there for the rest of her career. But the story doesn't end there, because the legacy of Captain Maya Ray's, call sign Gravedigger, wasn't just the missions she flew or the lives she saved. It was what came after, the example she set, the door she opened, the proof she offered that competence and courage were genderless, that the only thing that mattered in the cockpit was whether you could do the job and do it well, and do it when it counted most. 3 years after her deployment, a young woman named Lieutenant A-10 graduated from undergraduate pilot training and was assigned to the A-10. She requested Oceana specifically because she had heard about Maya Ray's. She wanted to learn from her. Maya took her under her wing, taught her everything she knew, and when Chen asked about the call sign, Maya told her the whole story. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. The mistakes, the choices, the cost of being right when everyone else was wrong. Chen listened, took notes, and 6 months later deployed to Afghanistan herself. She flew 70 missions, came back with a medal and a call sign of her own, Sledgehammer. When reporters asked her about it, she said, "I learned from the best. Captain Ray's taught me that the job isn't about being liked. It's about being trusted, and trust is earned one mission at a time." More pilots came through Oceana. More students learned from Maya. Some of them were men who had grown up hearing the stories, who came to the squadron expecting someone 10 feet tall and made of steel, only to find a quiet, disciplined woman who spoke in measured tones and expected excellence without excuses. Some of them were women who saw in Maya the possibility of their own futures, who realized that the barriers they feared were made of perception, not physics, and that perception could be shattered with skill and persistence. Maya retired in 2032 after 20 years of service. She had flown over 1,000 missions, accumulated more flight hours in the A-10 than any other pilot in her generation, and trained more than 200 students. At her retirement ceremony, the hangar at Oceana was packed. Marines, airmen, soldiers, people she had saved, and people she had trained. The commander of Air Combat Command gave a speech. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force presented her with a Legion of Merit. But the moment that mattered came after the ceremony, when the crowd dispersed and only the people who knew her best remained. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, now an instructor herself, walked up to Maya and said, "Ma'am, what do you want your legacy to be?" Maya looked around the hangar at the faces of the pilots she had trained, at the A-10s parked on the flight line, at the plaque someone had mounted near the entrance that read, "Captain Maya Ray's, Gravedigger 11, Integrity, Excellence, Service Above Self." She thought about the question for a long time. Then she said, "I don't get to choose my legacy. The people I flew for, the people I trained, they get to decide what it means. All I can do is make sure the work was worth remembering." Chen nodded. "It was, ma'am, it absolutely was." Maya left the Air Force that day, but she never really left the cockpit. She became a consultant, training civilian pilots, working with defense contractors on close air support tactics, writing articles about airmanship and decision-making under pressure. She gave talks at military academies, at pilot training programs, at conferences where the audience was full of people who had heard the stories and wanted to hear them again from her own voice. And sometimes, late at night, she would sit in her study and look at the plaque from Lieutenant Tran's platoon, at the letter from the 63 Marines, at the photographs of her on the flight line at Dwyer, and she would remember what it felt like to be trusted with someone's life, to carry that weight, to know that the choices she made determined who went home and who didn't. It was the heaviest thing she had ever carried. It was also the most meaningful. In 2035, Corporal James Haddock, now a civilian working as a firefighter in North Carolina, was interviewed for a documentary about the war in Afghanistan. The interviewer asked him what moment defined his experience. He didn't hesitate. He told them about the Wadi, about the morning his fire team thought they were going to die, about the sound of the A-10's cannon tearing through the air like the world itself was angry. And then he said, "There was a pilot that day. Captain Maya Reyes, call sign Gravedigger. She didn't know us, didn't know our names or our faces, but she flew into hell for us anyway, and she didn't leave until we were safe. That's what courage looks like. That's what honor looks like. And I've spent every day since trying to live up to the example she set." The documentary aired in 2036. It included interviews with dozens of veterans, all of them telling similar stories, all of them mentioning the same call sign, Gravedigger. The name that started as an insult had become something else, a legend, a standard, a reminder that the best pilots weren't always the ones who flew the fastest or climbed the highest, but the ones who showed up when it mattered, who made the hard calls, who carried the weight without complaint. Maya watched the documentary at home, alone, with a glass of whiskey she didn't finish. When it ended, she turned off the television and sat in the dark, thinking about the kid she had been when she first climbed into an A-10, about the captain she became in the deserts of Helmand, about the instructor who taught a generation of pilots what it meant to serve. She thought about Vickers, wherever he was, and whether he ever regretted what he said. She thought about the 23 Afghan police officers and the 2 kids in the courtyard, the ones she never met but whose lives were woven into hers forever. She thought about all of it, the weight and the meaning and the cost, and then she stood up, walked to her desk and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the young pilots who would come after her, the ones who would face the same doubts, the same whispers, the same weight of proving themselves in a world that didn't always want to believe. She told them the truth, that the job was hard, that the choices were impossible, that the cost was real and lasting, but that it was also worth it, not for the medals or the recognition, but for the people who needed them, for the voices on the radio, for the faces in the targeting pod, for the moment when the only thing standing between life and death was a pilot who refused to quit. She ended the letter with the words that had guided her through every mission, every decision, every moment of doubt. "Show up, do the work, trust yourself. The rest will follow." She sealed the letter, addressed it to the 75th Fighter Squadron, and mailed it the next morning. It arrived 3 weeks later, was read aloud at a squadron meeting, and was pinned to the wall in the ready room where every pilot could see it. It stayed there for years, yellowing with age, the ink fading but the words still legible. And every pilot who read it, whether they knew the name or the call sign or the story, understood the message. That legacy wasn't something you declared. It was something you built, one mission at a time, one choice at a time, one life saved at a time. Maya Reyes passed away in 2054 at the age of 73 from complications of a stroke. Her funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The Marines sent a color guard. The Air Force sent a flyover. The crowd was so large that it spilled out beyond the cemetery walls, hundreds of people who had flown with her, learned from her, been saved by her. They came from all over the country, some of them in uniform, some in civilian clothes, all of them carrying the same thing, the memory of what she had done and who she had been. The eulogy was delivered by Lieutenant General A-10, now the commander of Air Combat Command. She spoke about Maya's career, her achievements, her contributions to the Air Force, but what she spent the most time on was the legacy. Captain Maya Reyes, Chen said, was not a perfect person. She made mistakes. She carried burdens. She faced doubts and criticisms that would have destroyed lesser pilots, but she never quit, she never gave up. She showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of it. She showed us that honor isn't about being liked, it's about being trusted. And she showed us that legacy isn't measured in medals or promotions, but in the lives we touch and the example we leave behind. The flyover came at the end of the ceremony. 4 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs flying in formation, their twin engines roaring like thunder. They approached from the south, low and fast, and when they reached the cemetery, one of them pulled up and away, the missing man formation, a tribute to a pilot who would never fly again. The crowd watched in silence as the lone aircraft climbed into the sky, higher and higher, until it disappeared into the clouds. And then the silence broke. One by one, the people who had known Maya, who had flown with her, who had been saved by her, began to clap. It started with Corporal James Haddock, now an old man with grandchildren, his hands weathered and scarred. It spread through the crowd, a wave of sound that grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. It wasn't just applause. It was gratitude. It was recognition. It was the sound of a legacy that would never be forgotten. The clapping lasted for 5 minutes. When it finally stopped, the crowd began to disperse, but many of them stayed behind. They gathered around the gravesite, sharing stories, remembering moments, speaking her name with the kind of reverence reserved for people who change the world not through grand gestures but through the quiet, persistent accumulation of courage and integrity. They talked about missions they had flown together, lessons they had learned, the way she had always been there when it mattered. They talked about the call sign, about what it meant, about how it had transformed from an insult into a badge of honor. And they talked about the future, about the pilots who would come after them, who would carry the torch, who would remember that excellence and honor were earned, not given. As the sun set over Arlington, a young pilot stood at the edge of the crowd, listening. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Park, and she had just graduated from pilot training. She had requested the A-10, had asked to be assigned to Oceana because she had read about Maya Reyes in a history book and wanted to follow in her footsteps. She didn't know anyone here, didn't know the stories firsthand, but she knew the legacy. And as she stood there listening to the veterans talk, she made a promise to herself. That she would honor that legacy, that she would show up, that she would do the work, that she would trust herself, that when the call came she would answer. Because that's what Gravedigger taught them, not just how to fly, but how to live.